Amen. All right, we are in John chapter 4. John chapter 4, we're going to start in verse 51. Going back to verse 46, a certain man came along and met Jesus. It doesn't really say a whole lot about him other than he was a nobleman. And he asked Jesus, sought him out for the healing of his son. That was the purpose of him coming down to speak to Jesus, was the healing of his son. So in verse 48, there was some contention between Jesus and the Jews about what was going on, and we got to, and he ended up telling this nobleman. In verse 50, he says, "Go thy way, thy son liveth." Okay? So that's where we ended it. That's where we got to the point where we had to stop, and it was kind of right at a pivotal moment, because in verse 51, it says, and as he was now going down, his servants met him and told him, saying, "Thy son liveth." So as he was going home, one of his servants met him along the way and reached out to him and tells him about his boy's recovery. And you can just imagine the joy that this man felt, right? Because, I mean, he made a trek and he made a journey to go see Jesus about his son who was ill. And that's the case for any of us who are parents. We would make a journey for our children, right, who are ill or who need something, right? That's grown or not, right? And that's just the way it is. So he made this journey, and he was obviously pretty intelligent, and he was obviously pretty spiritually minded, because at this moment, instead of just running home and being with his child, which is what a normal response would be, he stops and he asks his servant a question. He gets to thinking, and he says, "At what time did he begin to get better?" And we see that in verse 52. "Then inquireth he of them the hour which he began to amend. And they said unto him, Yesterday at the 7th hour, but the fever left him. So he asked him, when was he healed? And he said it was the previous day around noon. And verse 53 explains why he asked that question. So the father knew. His father knew. Do you remember when we started talking about the book of John? Do you remember when we started talking and I said that the book of John has this kind of repeated theme throughout this whole thing about making sure the purpose of John writing his book was to make sure that you knew something, right? That's a reoccurring thing all the way through, not just this book, but all of John's writings, right? To give you a surety about something. And he gives an example here of a man who figured something out, right? And it says, and he knew the moment, right? It was the moment, it was the time that Jesus, verse 53, so the father knew that it was at the same hour in which Jesus said unto him, Thy son liveth, and himself believed. Okay, that's important, right? Obviously, he had some sort of spirituality and some sort of faith that Jesus was going to be able to do something for his son. There was obviously that there, right? But he wasn't to the point where he believed that Jesus says he maybe said who he was, right? He might not have believed that to that extent, but he understood that there's a man who's doing some things, and maybe he can help my son. And the moment he had the light switch, the switch just flipped, and he understood. That was the same time that I was talking to Jesus, and he told me to go home. Your son's going to live. What did that do? It bolstered his faith. You know what that is? That's an answer to prayer. Answer to prayers bolster your faith. Seeing God work in your life bolsters your faith, right? That's what he was doing. And it says at that moment, at that time, it wasn't until he put those two things together that Jesus was not just some prophet, was not just some man. not even just some prophet, but there was truly something special about Jesus. That's when he believed, right? And it took a moment, it took an encounter with Jesus in order to get that, right? And when we see Jesus after his resurrection, he goes to the ladies, and then he goes to the 12, but there's one missing, right? Thomas isn't there. And then the next time he goes to him, Thomas is there, and he pops into the room. He doesn't say anything to anybody else, and he turns right to Thomas, and he says, "How you doing, bud?" You guys remember that story? That's where we get the story of doubting Thomas. And the long story short of this is he tells Thomas to go ahead and thrust his fingers in his wounds right here. I'll make sure I do that right. I did it wrong last week. I said here, it was here. It does semantics, right? And then his side. Don't forget the wound in his side. He said, "The wounds in my hands and my side," right? And what was Thomas's response? "My Lord and my God." And Jesus says, you said that right. You did good there, Thomas, right? And he says, "You saw and believed." He says, "But more blessed are those that never see me and still believe." Right? It took a moment here with Jesus for this man to see Jesus and have an encounter with Jesus. Now, I don't think that he actually had to see Jesus in order for him to believe. I think he was going to Jesus, and whether he met one of his disciples and his disciples told him the story and his disciples told him to go home, I think this thing would have happened the same way. This guy had a measure of faith, and he was out on a limb trying to get his son healed. Right? And it took that encounter with Jesus to do that. And he put two and two together. I knew when I spoke to Jesus, and that was about the moment he was healed, so that he knew that Jesus spoke the word. When he spoke the words in verse 50, he knew at that moment, right? That's when it happened. And that was enough for him. And he already believed to a point, but because he never would have bade Jesus to come if he didn't. If he didn't believe at all, he never would have bade Jesus to come. But this act increased his faith. And that increase in faith not only saved him, but I didn't finish the verse intentionally. Finish the verse. What's the last three words? Oh, 4 words, I'm sorry, and his whole house. Correct, right? So his encounter with Christ had more than an effect on him. His encounter with Christ had an effect on everybody that was around him. And that's the way we should be. That's us. Our encounter with Christ, that moment of salvation, should not just have an effect on me. It should have an effect on my whole house, right? I'm trying to remember what the story was that he's tied to. I think it was the story of the prison break, the Philippian jailer. I think it was the Philippian jailer. It was the Philippian jailer. When the Philippian jailer, the prison break happens, the earthquake, and the prisoners get out, and the Philippian jailer is getting ready to kill himself, and I think it was Paul, right? Was it Peter or Paul? It's Paul. It's Paul. It's Paul and Silas. Paul and Silas tell him not to do that, and then he takes him home, and he believes because of what some things happen, and the guy goes home, and his whole house gets saved. Right? He says, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" Right? In Acts chapter 2, they ask a similar question. It says, what must I do? There's no salvation intent there. What must I do? Not what must I do to be saved, like the Philippian jailer asked. The Philippian jailer asked specifically, what must I do to be saved? And Paul and Silas tell him, and he gets right. And he meets Jesus. And then he goes home, and his whole house was saved. Why? Because he met Jesus, right? Your encounter with Christ should have a greater impact and a greater effect than just on you. And that's the bottom line. There's been studies on this, that when the husband or man of the home, so to speak, finds Jesus first, gets saved, right? When they get saved first, the whole household has a 40% higher chance of coming to Jesus Christ than if it's the woman who comes to Christ first. There's something about the spiritual head of the household, the man of the house, who gets saved. Something about that, right? That's not to say that there's not power in a praying wife who is spiritual and religious, for lack of a better term, religious, and praying for her husband, right? There's something to say about that. There's power there, right? And those kids have a stand a chance, right? But there's something about when the man of the house, the spiritual head of that household, gets right first. There's something about that. I can't explain it other than that's the way God works. You know, there's something special about that. But anyway, at the end of the verse, it says he believed in his whole house. And once he told everybody the circumstances of his encounter with Christ, they all believed, right? This man was a witness and a testimony for Jesus Christ, which we all should be. You got Jesus in you? You got Jesus in you? Then you got a reason to be a witness and a testimony for him, right? All right, verse 54. It says, this is again the second miracle that Jesus did when he went to come out of Judea into Galilee. So a second public miracle. All right, his second public miracle. Any questions on John chapter 4? Okay, good. John chapter 5. It says, after this there was a feast of the Jews, and he went up to and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. Okay, so before we actually get into the act of what happened here and the whole purpose of what happened here, there's one word that's really in contention in a lot of people's minds here that study the Scripture and that kind of do some deep in-depth study. There's one word that's in here, that's in this verse, that is in verse 2, that's kind of in contention, and that's the word Hebros, Hebros. That's the Greek word that was used. Can anybody guess what word that is? Hebrew, right? That's not a stretch, is it? Hebros sounds just like Hebrew. Spelled almost the same. The Greek word for Hebrew is Hebros. Okay? And we see that translated Hebrew here. And it's correct. It's translated correctly in a lot of other Bibles too. And the New King James is translated correctly. And the New American Standard, the Revised Standard Version, the Good News Bible, Darby's Bible even gets it right. But there was one translation that decided this needed to be changed, and that was the NIV. The NIV. Does anybody have an NIV here? No? You guys are getting better at answering that question. No, I don't have one of those things here. I have one. This is actually, the only NIV I have is this little bitty pocket NIV. And as you can tell, I need glasses, so I can't hardly even read the silly thing. This is a massive thing. This is just the New Testament, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's an 8 translation New Testament. So it has 8 different translations if you want to compare. Okay. Now the only 2 that are worth really even reading and comparing, it has the King James, it has the Living Bible, which really isn't even a Bible, right? It's a commentary on the Bible. Phillips Modern English. Has anybody ever met anybody who's read the Phillips Modern English or uses that? Okay, it's irrelevant, right? The RSV, that one's might be useful in comparisons, right? Today's English version, the NIV, the Jerusalem Bible, and the New English Bible. All the rest of those are pretty much worthless. All right, but if we go to John chapter 5, and I am reading in the King James Version in verse 2, and it says, Now there is a pool at Jerusalem by the sheep market, a pool, which in the Hebrew tongue, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. Now the New International Version says in chapter 5, verse 2, it says, Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool which in Aramaic is called Bethesda. Okay? So that begs the question, where in the world did Aramaic come into the play? Like I said, some of these versions that came before the NIV all have Hebrew. None of them have Aramaic until the NIV. So something had to have changed. Well, when you dig into that, you find out that the Catholic Church had something to do with that. That was heavily inspired by the Catholic Church. And the reason it was so heavily inspired by the Catholic Church is that they had to try to prove that Jesus spoke Aramaic. And the reason that they have to try to prove that Jesus spoke Aramaic has absolutely nothing to do with this verse. But it has everything to do with Matthew chapter 16, verse 18. Matthew chapter 16, verse 18 is, we all know this verse. It says, "And I say unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church," right? "And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." We know that verse. Everybody knows that verse. Everybody knows that the Catholic Church uses that verse to try to prove that Peter was the foundation and Peter was the rock that the church was built on, right? The universal church, which is all, the word Catholic literally means universal. That's what the word means. So when they say the Catholic Church, you have to be careful. Is it talking about the religious Catholic Church? Because some of the early church fathers wrote about the Catholic Church not being the Catholic Church as we know it today. Just talking about the spiritual church, the universal church, right? But the pagan and Christian, quote unquote, Catholic Church insists that Jesus spoke Aramaic for this one verse only, right? They have to prove that he spoke Aramaic. So they change about 10 to 15 other verses, 10 to 12 other verses in the New Testament just to try to prove that he spoke Aramaic in Matthew chapter 16. Well, why? Okay, well, the reason is the word rock in Greek, the Greek word, the Hebrew word for rock is Petra. "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock," Petra, Petra. Okay. Now, the word that used to describe Peter's name, the Greek word is Petros, Petros. Petros, not Petra. Petra is a feminine word. You know, if anybody here has ever spoken any kind of other languages, you understand there are some words that are masculine and some words that are feminine. That's common knowledge, right? Even languages get it right. There's male and female. There's masculine and feminine, right? So, they use the word Petra to describe rock in Greek. And they use the word Petros to say Peter. "Thou art Peter, Petros, and upon this rock, Petra." That change indicates that he's not talking about Peter. Does that make sense? You following? Okay, good. But in order for the Catholic Church to use this verse to claim that Peter was the rock, they have to change it to Aramaic, because the word for Peter and the word for rock in Aramaic are the same word. So in order for the Catholics to try to prove that Peter was really the rock, they have to change history. So how do they do that? They attack the book, and they change it. They change it in 10 other places, and we're going to go through a couple of them here in just a minute. So the word in Aramaic, the word for rock and Peter is Petra. Petra. Just like the word for rock in Greek is Petra. But the difference is Peter's name, Petros. So they can't have that. They can't have that distinction. So they have to change it. So it says in Aramaic, if you were to read this book in Aramaic, "Thou art Peter, Petra, and upon this rock, Petra." Keeps it consistent for the Catholics. So they can use Peter as the first pope. That's what they try to do, right? So the New Testament, the NIV translators try to validate the Catholic Church's claim, because they claimed this before the NIV, long before the NIV was translated, right? So the NIV is trying to validate the Catholic Church's claim. There is absolutely no manuscript authority. When I say manuscript, it's the pieces of relics and the pieces of books and pieces of codexes and pieces of papyrus that we have found, not we, that history has discovered, right? that has that verse in it. There is no manuscript evidence for Aramaic in that verse, ever, until it was translated into Aramaic, which was after. They have found verses that are Aramaic there, but they found much, much, much earlier ones that have Greek, right? So, in order to change history, they have to establish a pattern of Jesus and others using Aramaic instead of Greek. So, it's not a simple mistake, it's an intentional deception. Because you can look at Luke chapter 23, verse 38. Luke 23, 38. And, well, you don't have to look. We can just go through. I'm going to read what it says in the NIV. So instead of just trying to save us time, instead of flipping to all those, I just copied and pasted what all the NIVs have. So in Luke 23, 38, do you remember the story of Jesus on the cross? You remember that? That was kind of an important story. Do you remember the thing that they nailed above his head on the cross? And it says, the King of the Jews, right? Here's the King of the Jews. Well, here's what the NIV says about it. And there was written a notice above him which read, this is the King of the Jews. You know what they took out? The 3 languages it was written in. It says it was written in 3 different languages. Does anybody remember the languages? What are they? What's that? Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Well, in order to avoid this problem, they just take the whole part of the phrase out, even though there is manuscript evidence to show that it should be there. They just remove it to try to stop any conflict, right? All right, well, maybe that's just one example. There's, maybe that was just an honest mistake. John chapter 19, verse 13. This is the NIV, so you got to kind of have to piece some things together. So the NIV is hard to read after you've been reading the King James for a while. You ever notice that? It's real hard to read. Anyway, when Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat him down at the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which is in Aramaic is Gabbatha. Do you guys remember that story? That's not at all true. Look at John chapter 19 and verse 13. John chapter 19, verse 13. And Pilate therefore heard the saying, and he brought Jesus forth, and he sat him down in the judgment seat, which is the place called the pavement, which is in the Hebrew Gabbatha. Okay, so they just simply swap out Hebrew and Aramaic, right? Why? To try to prove that Aramaic was being used and spoken and things of that nature, right? In John chapter 19, he says it again in verse 17. This is what the King James says, and he, bearing his cross, went forth to a place called the place of a skull, which is in the Hebrew, Golgotha. We know that, right? Golgotha, the place of a skull, right? And carrying his own cross, this is the NIV, he went to his place called the skull, which is in Aramaic, called Golgotha. Okay, verse 20. Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified near the city was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. So they ignore it in one spot, remove it, and then in the Gospel of John, there's so much evidence for that, their 3 languages being shown there, that they have to change it from Hebrew to Aramaic. They can't just discard it. There's just so much evidence for that it's supposed to be there, that if they just discarded it, they would have a problem. So what do? They have to change it. Acts chapter 21. Acts 21:40. We'll just go through maybe 1 or 2 more. I just want to show you that this is a pattern. This is not some random mistake. Acts chapter 21, verse 40. And when he had given him license, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned him, right? Beckoned with his hand unto the people, and there was a great silence, and he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue. Now, this is crucial. This is important because Paul's arrested here, right? And he has the Pharisees and people. He has these people that are fighting and arguing about what he says. So he speaks to them in their tongue. Who is he speaking to? Hebrew. The Jews. So he speaks to them in what language? The language of the Jews. Well, here's what it says in Acts 21, verse 40 in the NIV. And after receiving his commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic. They changed it to Aramaic. Why would he speak Aramaic to a bunch of Hebrew Jews? Doesn't make any sense. But in order to establish that pattern, they have to change it. Give me a second. Let me finish my thought. Right? Acts 22, verse 2. And he heard them speak in Aramaic, and they became very quiet. So it's the same story. Next chapter, in order to be consistent, they change it to Aramaic again. Right? Acts chapter 26. And he fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying unto me, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? You remember that? The conversion of Saul, conversion of Paul? This is Jesus talking to a Jew. Why would Jesus talk to a Jew in Aramaic? But that's what the NIV says. He says he spoke to him in Aramaic instead, and he spoke to him in the Hebrew. So I wanted to show you this, that this is not, when you hear me rail and rant on some of these things about how these perversions, as I call them, right, are lying to you, and they don't do it out of the goodness of their heart. Well, we just want a thought-for-thought translation. That's not, you're going to see here again in just a moment, another thing with the NIV that completely removes a verse. I mean, completely removes the verse. And they expect you to understand what the story is. The verse is crucial to you understanding what the whole story is. It's about the angel coming down and troubling the water. That's gone in the NIV. Just gone. And they even keep the same numberings. They'll keep the same numberings. They'll put 4 and a dash. Or they'll just put 3 and then they'll jump right to 5 and hope that you don't notice. Right? Well, if it's not supposed to be there, why don't you just change the numbers? Why doesn't what they say is verse 4 that shouldn't be there really become the verse 5? Why doesn't that move up and become verse 4 if it's not supposed to be there? And they can't even get their story straight. But anyway, right? In so many of these other places, in John chapter 20, verse 16, they insert Hebrews into the text. Hebros into the text so they can translate it Aramaic. There's nothing talking about Hebrew or Aramaic in the whole verse. They insert the word Hebros and translate it Aramaic to try to prove something. We're not going to go through that one. And then we can even look at Philippians chapter 3 when he says Hebrew of the Hebrews. That's messed up too. But we're not going to do that. And since then, other translations have followed suit with the NIV. But the NIV was the first to do that. And that should raise a red flag to some people. It should raise a red flag. I mean, it's one thing to just grab a Bible and start reading it. Now, look, you hear me kind of bash these other translations all the time. You can get saved out of an NIV. You can. You can absolutely get saved out of an NIV. You can grow out of an NIV. You can. You just don't have certain things in the NIV that the King James would give you, right? It's just not there, right? So when I say that the King James is God's words in English for us, I mean that, because no other translation has it like that. They just don't, right? So, and it was done like that intentionally. The devil does things like that to try to distract us from what God would have for us. You have to understand, the devil is a master manipulator. He knows how to manipulate people. He knows how to deceive people. And he's a counterfeiter. So everything that God does, everything that God has that is good, Satan has to counterfeit. He does. God had a system in place on this earth, and then we ruined it, and what did the devil do? He counterfeited it. Right? And now he's the God of this world. God gave us good music, did he not? Good music that praises and honors and glorifies him. Well, the devil counterfeited that right away. All of the miracles that that Moses provided by the power of God, what did the devil do? He counterfeited them until he got to a point where he couldn't. But he tried to counterfeit everything, right? Every good thing that God has, the devil will counterfeit. So it stands to reason that if we have something that's perfect and pure and preserved, the devil would try to counterfeit it. Isn't that logical? God says he's going to preserve his words. He even says that in the NIV. He even says that in these other translations, that he's going to preserve his words. And the scholars will explain that away by saying, well, he did preserve his words in the original languages. Which means absolutely nothing, right? Means nothing. It's just a way of trying to sound smarter than you and try to pull your faith away from the book. Look, if you can't have faith in the book that you read and profess to believe, you got no business even worshiping. What's the point? Oh, I know, I believe in God, but I don't believe in the Bible. What's the point? If those are God's words. You don't really believe God then. You just have this fake spirituality because you don't have any foundation. You don't have anything to stand upon. That's why I harp on this book a lot, because it means something. It's important, right? And if you don't have a solid foundation, how can you ever learn? How could you ever grow if you're not having a foundation that is solid and something that you can build upon? Now, I had a couple hands up. You had one, right? I'll get to you. Go ahead.
Is the NIV inspired?
No. Is the NIV inspired?
Non-inspired version.
Right. The NIV stands for non-inspired version. It doesn't. It stands for New International Version. But the NIV doesn't even come from the same manuscripts, the same historical documents as the King James. There are two different lines of manuscripts where we find historically where we can find copies of the Bible written and rewritten and translated and all those things. You have the Alexandrian manuscript. Now, where's Alexandria at? Egypt. Has anybody ever heard a good thing God speak about Egypt? No, he doesn't. Jesus, the only good thing about there was that Jesus was there while he was fleeing persecution, and then he called his son out of it. That's the only good thing it says about Egypt, is that he left Egypt, right? Okay, so the Alexandrian line of manuscripts. Has anybody ever heard of the Great Library of Alexandria? Okay, so that's where a lot of these manuscripts come from. They come from North Africa, Alexandria. And then there's a line of manuscripts that comes from Syria, Antioch specifically, right? But from Syriac. You'll hear, you might hear me talk in passing about an old Syriac translation or an old Syriac Bible, right? That's the text that we get our King James from. The Textus Receptus comes from the line in Syria. So there are two competing lines of manuscripts. So the one in North Africa was written by people like Origen and heretics, people who rejected Christ and didn't even believe that Christ was God. He was a created being, right? And then you have the followers of the disciples who were called Christians first in Antioch, who followed that heritage of the apostles and the disciples and Jesus Christ, and they have their manuscripts. So when you compare the two, they're not the same. They conflict in a lot of places. So when they were creating the canon of our Bible, when the early church fathers, I guess you would say, got together and decided solidly on the canon of our Bible, there was already our Bible in existence. It was already put together. All 66 books were already put together. They just ratified that these are the ones that come from Syria, and these are the ones that don't contradict each other. These are the ones that don't have the Apocrypha in it. These are the ones that don't have all of these problem texts in it. And we're going to say that this is God's written word for man, right? Now, that was in their language, right? And then it was eventually translated into English, right? But the ones that were in Alexandria did the same thing, but they used a Catholic council to say all of that, right? So it wasn't the people who were actually following Christ and his example and his disciples of his disciples of his disciples. They decided to run to North Africa and adopt a Catholic manuscript. So when I say the NIV is not translated, I mean not inspired, I mean that because it comes from heretical sources. Yeah. Sure.
But a lot I don't understand.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The reason I asked that question is because I wasn't sure.
No, yeah, and I'm sorry I kind of gave this whole long church history manuscript evidence kind of response to that, but and believe it or not, that is a very, very, very brief and condensed answer. Because the answer to that question, I can preach on for a month. And I don't even know half of the sources, right? But they're out there. And when you start reading, getting into some of the manuscripts and all that stuff, you can physically see the difference, right? But to answer your question, is the NIV inspired? Absolutely not. No. But you had something.
You have to examine the text
Sure.
in English because you're an English speaker and
Right.
find the lies.
Mm-hmm.
For example, you quoted as Paul, who was after the riot, was speaking, in Hebrew or
And
Aramaic,
yeah.
speaking to Jews, but what's important is before that, they're taking him into the castle,
Right.
and he turns around to Lysias and says, "Can I talk to you?"
Can I talk to you?
Lysias
Yep.
says, "Can you speak Greek?"
Yeah.
And then he says, "Aren't you the guy?" And then Paul.
Yeah, they had a discussion about the language before that.
Did
right?
Paul
And-
speak Aramaic to him? No, he spoke.
He
Greek.
spoke in Greek to him because he was a Greek, and
No,
then
he's a Roman.
he's a Roman, but they
That's their
spoke.
common language.
Right, that was their language. He didn't speak in Aramaic to him. He spoke in Greek to him. And then when he turned to his people, he spoke in Hebrew. Why? Because he wanted his people to stand up for him. He related to, I'm all things to all men, remember?
And a lot of them didn't
Right.
speak Greek.
Right? And then Paul, that's not the first time Paul's done this. Paul did this again when the Pharisees and the Sadducees were arguing about him.
Yeah.
Right? What did he say? Am I not a Pharisee?
War.
He goes, I believe in the resurrection. I'm not a Sadducee. And they were both trying to kill him. And since the Pharisees and Sadducees, since they didn't like each other, since the Sadducees wanted to kill him, he declared himself to be a Pharisee. The Pharisee says, well, he's on our side. We can't kill him. Paul was smart, man. He understood how it went.
Pastor,
Yes, sir.
what's that old saying? You climb a 20-foot pole to tell a lie when you could stand on the ground and tell the truth.
I've never heard that saying, but go ahead.
Well, that's sort of a criticism, of course. This is lots of lies because Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani is Aramaic.
Yep.
And Matthew says, which is to say, my God,
Why hast thou forsaken me? Yep.
So he said that Jesus said in anguish on the cross,
Right.
a Hebrew verse
Yep.
of Psalm 22.
Yep.
And he said it in his reflex language, which was probably Aramaic.
Sure.
He didn't even quote it in Hebrew.
Right.
But these people will stand
Well,
on the top of the pole
the problem
and
is,
tell you lies about language.
the problem is this was not by some chance that they changed these.
No.
This was intentional to try to deceive you so that they can prove that thou art Peter and upon this rock. Can you imagine changing words that God has put down on paper? Can you imagine changing words to just try to prove your point? I mean, you hear me preach about that. When you approach this Bible and try to prove what you want in your head already, the Bible will show you the verses to do it. It'll let you find those verses to prove whatever sin you want. Can you imagine being so arrogant to say, you know what, God, I think in order to prove that my church is the right church, I'm just going to go ahead and rewrite history. Oh, my goodness. Anyway, we got to move on. I'll talk to you afterwards.
Petra,
What's that?
the city of rock.
Well, Sila Petra is a city out in Turkey. Jordan, yes. It's Moab, you're correct. It's in Jordan. And Petra is it's where the Jews are Jews and anybody really who's in the area that heeds the scripture and say, when you see this, run. And they're going to run to Petra. It's a hidden city. It's a rock city. It's a tourist trap now. It's not such a tourist trap. I mean, I want to go there. I would love to. You guys ever seen the big giant wall where it's a giant stone side of a cliff and there's just a city built into it, right? It's beautiful. So I have so many pictures of it. I would absolutely love to see it. But I'll probably never get over there. But that's beside the point. But that's when you see that word Selah in the Psalms, or when and this is why I talked about doctrinal application to things. This, when it talks about Selah and a second coming psalm there, or millennial reign psalm there, it's probably talking not just in the musical application of the word Selah, but the doctrinal application of the word Selah, which is where they're going to run, Selah Petra, the city of the rock, right? So that's what Petra is, right? And National Geographic did a big thing on them a while back, and I think Miss Lily brought me a National Geographic with all of the pictures in one time after I talked about it. It's truly amazing. All right, verse 3. And these, Jesus walks in. He went up to Jerusalem, and he went to the sheep market, a pool. By the sheep market, there was a pool, and it had 5 porches. Okay, all of the translations agree on that, right? In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind and halt and withered, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain season to the pool and troubled the water. Whosoever then was first after troubling the water stepped in was made whole of whatsoever disease it has. Okay, let's get the trusty NIV back out. I'm going to read you. You guys follow along in your King James. We're going to start in verse 3. Here, a great number of disabled people used to lie: the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. Okay? Verse 6. When Jesus saw him lying there, what happened?
Oh, we can subtract here.
Took out verse 4. Completely gone. Completely gone. Not even there. They don't just do that. They remove the second half of verse 3 as well, if you didn't notice that. You know what they took out of verse 3? That an angel came and disturbed the waters. What did I say, verse 3? No, I'm sorry, waiting for the moving of the water in verse 3. That's what they take out. The waiting for the moving of the water is completely removed. And then they take all of verse 4 out. For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water. Whatsoever then first after the troubling of the water stepped in was made whole of whatsoever disease he has. So they took out the troubling of the water. They were waiting for the troubling. So the NIV paints a picture of he walked into the sheep gate, right? The sheep market through a gate, and there was a place there that had 5 porches, and there was a pool there. And a bunch of invalids, people who were halt, maimed, blind, whatever, would hang around that pool. That's what you get from the NIV. But what you get from the King James is that all of that is true. But the reason they were there was because they were waiting for that water to be troubled, because an angel came down and touched the waters. And when the waters were troubled, the first person who was into the water after the waters were troubled by the angel was healed of their infirmity. It's a little bit of a detail to leave out, isn't it? It doesn't even make sense in the NIV. Yet why would a bunch of invalids just be hanging around a pool? It doesn't make sense. It removes the entire point, right? It removes what troubles the water. We find out in verse 7, an angel, right? Look at verse 7. So the impotent man answered him, Sir, I have no man that when the water is troubled to put me into the pool, but while I am coming, another steppeth down. If you were to read that and not understand that it was an angel that came and troubled the water and you were healed when you get in there, it makes no sense. You get to verse 7, and Jesus is having a conversation with him, and he says, do you want to be healed? And he says, yeah, I want to be healed, but whenever the water gets troubled, I try to get in there in time, but I can't. Someone beats me to it. Well, if you don't have verse 4 to tell you that an angel troubles the water and you get healed, verse 7 makes no sense. Why are they? What's the deal with the water being troubled? Why are you trying to get into the pool after the water being? They take the whole thing out. Why? No clue. There's manuscript evidence to say that it should be in there, It's in some of the major documents. It should be there, but for some reason, they take it out. Verse 4 is in the majority of text, and it's only removed from a few manuscripts. This is a quote. It's removed from Aleph, from manuscript B, from manuscript C, manuscript P66, manuscript P75, manuscript 125, manuscript A, and manuscript C. The problem with manuscript A and manuscript C is that it's in some of the copies of manuscript A and manuscript C, but it's not in some copies of the manuscript A and manuscript C. Well, what do you mean? There's more than one manuscript A? Yeah, there's like hundreds of them. Well, what do you mean? Well, because the Bible was written by a bunch of different people, right? And it's in some of the versions, it's in some of the manuscript A's that they found, but it's not in all of them. So it's kind of unreliable on whether or not you can trust manuscript A in John chapter 5. Those are all Alexandrian texts, by the way, that I'm quoting. But anyway, all of those manuscripts have other issues to prove that they're not trustworthy, right? But it's in all of the majority texts for the King James. It's in it. And it's in a lot of their texts. It's just removed from some of them. So what do? Well, let's just ignore it.
Pick and choose.
Let's just ignore that it's supposed to be there. So what they will do is they will, I think I said this a little bit earlier, they will say verse 3, and then when it comes to verse 4, they'll stop at verse 3 talking about the halt, the blind, and the withered. They don't even use that terminology. They use the word disabled, right? And then they'll stop, not saying anything about the moving of the water. And then in verse 4, they'll either jump straight to verse 5 and not put anything for verse 4 there, or if they're honest, they'll put verse 4 and put a dash. I've seen them both. That's what they do. Now, if I was in my Bible, and this is just me, but if I was in my Bible and I was reading along, and I read verse 3, and then I read verse 5, where'd verse 4 go? That would raise some questions for me. Now, maybe that's just the way I think. Maybe I'm just a little bit different than you guys. Some of you guys might go, I don't know what that is, and move on. That's not me. All right? When I find something that I don't understand, I dig, and 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 I dig until I figure out the heart of the matter. This is something that benefits you in Scripture. If you don't understand something, what do? You find verses that help you explain it, right? This is something called sola scriptura, right? Search the Scriptures. Scripture with Scripture, right? If you don't understand a verse, find a verse that explains it. Now, here's the thing. You don't take an easy verse, a verse that is clear, and interpret it with an unclear passage. You take an unclear passage and you interpret it with a clear passage. That makes sense, right? I don't understand about this. Here's something that kind of sheds some light on it. Maybe this is what it means. But never fails when we take a concept of searching the Scriptures and comparing Scriptures and sola scriptura, search the Scriptures. We always take a clear verse, something that is easy to understand, and we confuzzle it with something that's difficult. Why? Because we're human. That's just the way we work. I talked about that today. But that's the whole point, right? Is to search the Scriptures to find out what is true, right? And if you can't, if something's nagging at you, there's probably a reason something's nagging at you. Search it out. To me, just an entire verse missing, and the rest of the context, the rest of the story not really making sense, would be enough to drive me insane, right? That doesn't make any sense. What's wrong here, right? I was fortunate enough to not have the NIV. I was fortunate enough. And I say that because when I got saved, I was saved under a Bible-believing pastor who preached and taught and believed the King James Bible. I had a win right there. I mean, that was a layup for me. That was more than a layup. That was a slam dunk for me because that saved me a lot of heartache and a lot of trouble trying to search and find out which one is true. I had the truth right in front of me. Not everybody has that benefit, right? Not everybody has that advantage. They have to search that out themselves, right? Now, that doesn't mean I didn't search that out. I still searched it out because, of course, like I said, I don't just take my pastor's word for it. When Dave Hoffman would say something, I wouldn't take it as gospel, right? I wouldn't, and that's okay. I don't expect you to take what I preach here today and just not question anything. You should question those things. You should check those references. You should see if I'm telling the truth. Why? Because didn't we go through that verse, let God be true and every man a liar, right? We went through it in Psalms, right? I'm human. I make mistakes. Believe it or not, I've taught some people wrong before. And I've caught myself years later, right? Caught myself wrong. I've taught some things that are wrong here, and I've had to go back and correct them. I don't know if you guys caught that, right? Maybe you guys did. That's not something you guys latched onto, and when I taught it again, it was something that it was corrected and fixed. So hopefully that's the way it was. But that happens. That happens more often than not, right? But again, I had the advantage of jumping right into a Bible-believing church who believed this book. I had the distinct advantage of being taught the Bible by a man who actually believed what the book said, which is a huge advantage today, right? Because not everybody has that. Not all churches have that today. As a matter of fact, most don't. Most don't. Okay. So the NIV removes the last half of verse 3 and all of verse 4. Okay, so we understand that an angel would come down and trouble the waters, right? You know what? Let's go ahead and stop there because we're getting into a story that's going to take a few minutes. There's a man there who Jesus ends up healing, but we're gonna save that for next week. Any questions? Go ahead.
25 years ago, when I started reading the Bible,
Yep.
the guy I worked with, he was going to Calvary Chapel's Bible College,
Uh-huh.
and he gave me an NIV.
Mm-hmm.
And I told him I would read the whole thing through before I went to church, so I knew what they were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I never noticed that.
You never caught it?
Oh, I read it through at least once, probably twice.
You know there's like 14 more of those? Did you know that?
What's that?
There's like 14 more of those in the New Testament alone. And the Gospels alone. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's like something like 60.
How you know the difference between all these Bibles.
And there's like 16 whole verses that are just removed, right? That would drive me insane. Yeah. And most people don't. And most people don't. But appreciate that. Thank you. Anything else? He did. Correct. Yep. All of the manuscripts that we have. Yeah. Jesus spoke probably several different languages. Obviously, he spoke Hebrew. Obviously, he spoke Greek because we know he spoke in both of those. He probably did speak Aramaic because that was common language at the time. You got to understand, it's not like the United States where a melting pot of a lot of different areas, and melting pot, I mean, that's a term we haven't heard in a long time, right? Since middle school. But the common language in America, at least until recently, was what? English. And if you wanted to do anything, you spoke English. So people who come to the country, they had their original language, but what did they have to do in order to acclimate? They had to learn English. Well, in that area, there was all sorts of different languages that were used. We have a guy who's back there, he's a missionary to Burkina Faso, right? Each tribe in that area speaks a different language. Do you guys remember when he came out here and was talking about how he has to learn like 40 different languages because they all speak a different dialect, and some of them don't translate at all to each other, right? Well, that's the way it was for Jesus. He did speak Aramaic, right? But what I'm trying to get through is that when he spoke Aramaic, it was written in Hebrew. Why? Because he was writing to his people, the Jews. So we don't have any texts that I know of, I mean, I may be wrong, where Jesus quoted something or did something and the disciples wrote it in Aramaic. That's not It's not there. It doesn't exist.
A quote.
A quote might be in Aramaic,
Yes.
right? Half of the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic.
Right.
It is. It just is. And it says that, right? We can trust that. When it says, hey, I'm writing this in Aramaic, I mean, that's a red flag. Hey, this is Aramaic, right? We don't have any of that in the scriptures, in the New Testament. We have the Hebrew Old Testament, which some of it was written in Aramaic, and then we have the Greek New Testament, right, which takes some quotes from Aramaic and translates them into either Hebrew or Greek, depending on what they're doing, right? But we don't have Aramaic texts. We don't have them. Why? Because they don't exist. Because everybody wrote it in either Greek or Hebrew.
When he read the Isaiah scroll, which he clearly could read,
He read Hebrew. Jesus read Hebrew because he read from Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and the Psalms, right? All sorts of stuff. So obviously he knew Hebrew, right? So, and the common language at the time, the poor language is Aramaic or Hebrew, and then the higher tongue was Greek.
and if you had to deal with the Romans,
And if you have to deal with the Romans, then Latin, which is why you have Greek, Hebrew, and Latin written above Jesus' head on the cross. Because anybody who walked around there could speak one of those three languages, Greek, Hebrew, or Latin. Make sense? All right. So, okay, we'll just stop there. Never mind. We'll wait. You want to pray us out, please?